This whole rebalancing, I mean, it's a real place where the geopolitics and the economics really meet. The West has suddenly thought, well, we need to do something about this, and we need to secure our own supply chain, and we have to make sure we have our own critical minerals.
The US is clubbing together with other nations to make a critical mineral alliance. The reason? Well, to counter China's dominance, of course. But can the West really overcome its dependence on China?
And when we have China questions, we go to our China analyst, Clifford Coonan, who has more with us right now.
So, Clifford, what is this alliance all about? I mean, China's name didn't come up in the government fact sheet, which was all about the alliance, but yet it is really the elephant in the room here.
Yeah, well, these critical minerals, they're essential for use in semiconductors, in your iPhones, in all your various, in car manufacture. They're just used as components to make components for so many different things.
That people touch every day, part of everyday life.
Yeah, exactly. It's something, and most people, most of them come from China. China has got the best developed industry for producing critical minerals and rare earths. So basically, that means that when the US, for example, instigated the trade war with its trade tariffs, China was just able to say, "Okay, you can't have our critical minerals." So basically, the Trump administration caved. So they're a great bargaining chip for the Chinese. And with this in mind, the West has suddenly thought, well, we need to do something about this, and we need to secure our own supply chain, and we have to make sure we have our own critical minerals. Now, this has seen a lot of people going to Africa. It's seen a lot of people going to South America, looking for from the West, looking for their own resources. But then recently, Scott Bessent and Marco Rubio in the US have sort of decided that they want to form some kind of Western alliance where they will all secure the supply of rare earths. And the big thinking behind this is because Donald Trump is going to China in April, and he wants to have something big that he can deliver. So the expectation is that they will come up with this alliance of all these countries with the rare earths and critical minerals by that time, which, as we know from all of these trade agreements and everything like that, they just don't happen that quickly. So that's basically the background, and it's kind of an interesting idea, actually. And maybe with a different administration, it would be, it would be sort of more credible. It's just everyone's feeling a little bit battered at the moment. I mean, even thinking about this is exhausting, because we just had weeks of real antagonism from the US, and then suddenly you come around and say we want to be your friend. So it's just it's a pretty challenging prospect.
So what we've seen is a lot of European leaders say recently, Clifford, that they want more sovereignty. We saw that in Davos at the World Economic Forum. Even Mark Carney from Canada, the Prime Minister, said pretty much the same thing. And yet he's been to China to make deals. Keir Starmer from the UK has been to China to make deals. Of course, the complicated thing, which I want you to kind of unravel here, is just going and saying we're going to do some business with China isn't necessarily itself a bad thing. You can't cut off all ties all of a sudden overnight. No one's really expecting that. Where's the balance in all of this? On the one hand, building up this alliance to have more sovereignty, and on the other hand, doing business deals with China.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, let's just cast our minds back a few years, say 20 years, when China was starting to emerge. And you'd have these trade delegations that would go to China with the head of state. The German chancellor would go once, sometimes even twice a year. They would come with these glistening, shining, fantastic industrial products that China lapped up, and they would make billion dollar trade deals. They'd buy, engines, they'd buy technology, they'd buy all of this sort of stuff. And then the European leader would read out the list of human rights issues that it had, and the Chinese would nod, and that was it. And the economy just grew. China then as part of the deals, there was technology transfer. They were required to give insight into how the technology worked, which helped China build up this incredible industrial story that is China now. I mean, it's catching up on the West on many, many high tech fronts. It hasn't surpassed them yet, but it really is quite an incredible story, as we all know. So suddenly, when these Western leaders arrived, and that was what was really interesting, looking at Keir Starmer and looking at, Macron even, how the attitude has changed because China just doesn't really need them anymore. What it does see is it sees a customer. And that's a complete shift because China has suddenly, Europe has become a way of offsetting the market that it's lost because the US is basically closed. I mean, there's about $500 billion worth of exports goes to the EU from China last year. In the US, it was nearly half that, and it had dropped it was about 280 billion, and that was down from 430 billion or something in that direction. So you can sort of see that it's a real, it's a major change in things. And the other thing about the EU leaders going on their own, first of all, China doesn't need them, and China also sees a way to kind of divide the EU a little bit, because a lot of people see a lot of the bigger nations see see China as a strategic competitor, and you don't hear that language so much now from the big EU countries. But you are seeing divisions in how the EU reacts, because China really only worries about the EU when it's dealing with a bloc. It likes big. That's how these power blocks work, And then when you've got, Ireland and the Finns and okay, I know the UK isn't in the EU anymore, but in Europe anyway.
But the UK is part of this alliance, this critical minerals alliance with the US,
exactly.
And that fits into that whole modus operandi. Like, if we club together, then China's going to find it more difficult to divide and rule.
Yeah, and it's interesting. And then just to sort of shift perspective a bit over to this, this US idea about critical minerals, they're also trying this thing, Pax Silica, which is a sort of again, an alliance to combat China's increasing dominance in semiconductors. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, mentioned at Davos, I think, where he was saying the 97% of the high-end semiconductor chips are made in Taiwan, and this was possibly one of the biggest weaknesses in the global economy, because if that situation were to change, where the US, where China to invade Taiwan, then suddenly you're going to have a massive rebalancing of global power. And he's also said the same thing about critical minerals. He said that China's dominance is extremely dangerous. And he's talked about his own state, South Carolina, where they've started to do critical minerals again. And he reckons that they're going to be able to, they'll be up and running within 2 years. So this whole rebalancing, I mean, it's a real place where the geopolitics and the economics really meet, because, where previously military muscle was how you kind of backed up your ambitions, your diplomatic ambitions, your political ambitions. Now it seems to be raw materials, it's buying power, it's imports, exports, it's investment. It's all these. I think that they often talk about sanctions being sort of choke points. That you can, you don't really need to use your army anymore, although it helps to have a big one, or a powerful one. But you can back it up with economics. So I think it's very interesting the way all of these things are emerging right now.
But it's interesting, too, because so many of these things are related. If you want to have the newest defensive gear, smart weapons, and so on, you need these raw materials to make it work, right? You've hinted at this a little bit, Clifford, but I'm wondering, in your view, how dependent is Europe on China?
Well, this is a really interesting point. The problem for Europe now, and Germany, let's use Germany. I mean, we're in Germany, and Germany is a very good example, and it's the biggest economy in Europe. You have Friedrich Merz, who's said to be quite skeptical about China.
The Chancellor of Germany, for those.
The Chancellor of Germany, sorry, the Chancellor of Germany, and he's visiting. He's visiting very shortly, and he's going to China very shortly, and everyone's kind of wondering what he's going to do, because basically you have these big German car companies and these big German chemical companies, these big German industrial units that have got a lot of political influence, and they're heavily invested in China, to the point that they're going to invest even more in China, and they're going to start sending things back. to Europe. And that's how they hope to secure their future. But that's very bad for Germany's industrial base. And also these small and medium-sized firms who can't afford to do these kind of investments, they're really, they're struggling and they're worried, and they don't have the same sort of level of political influence, because some people you talk to say this could mean the eradication of Germany's industrial base. I mean, when you see Keir Starmer going, from the UK, where their industrial base has been eroded over years, but Germany still has a really strong industrial base, and it's a big chunk of the economy. So if that starts coming under threat, it's a real sign of that, it could be very bad for Germany. So I think the challenge for him is to try and balance this need to get the investments, and to have a good trading relation with China. But on the other hand, it needs to protect its industrial base. And you're hearing a lot more now from Europe, a realization that short-term people want China. They have this sort of, it's almost like a default setting. They're used to going to China, making, selling a load of aircraft engines and coming away with a couple of billion, now, but that isn't really happening anymore, because China's making its own aircraft engines. And what it's doing then, it's making them a lot cheaper than in Europe, and it's going to start selling them back to Europe, and it's a real threat.
That was a sneak preview of our podcast, The Dip.
And if you want to subscribe and get full episodes, then all you have to do is scan that little QR code that's on your screen right now.
We'll be back same time, same place with more. Until then, thanks for checking out The Dip.
See ya. Thank you very much. Bye for now.